Listen, alcohol is basically one giant scam. And the companies that sell alcohol want you to believe that drinking it enhances your life, but the truth is just far more sinister. See, in this video, I'm going to reveal 6 shocking truths that they don't want you to know about alcohol. And number 4 will stun you. Listen, these facts might just completely change your perspective on drinking for the rest of your life, so stay tuned because you might need to hear this. Now, a very quick introduction. My name is Leon Sylvester. I'm the founder of SoberClear.com, and we use a totally new method to help business owners and professionals take back control of their drinking. We use a mental model called first principles thinking, and then we have a future-focused coaching approach that doesn't rely on calling you an alcoholic or digging up the dirt from the past. It's completely different to everything else out there because it works by attacking the root cause of our drinking, which all starts by shifting our beliefs. Now, if you want to see if the program could be a good match for you, then go ahead and click the link in the description to book a roadmap call. You'll choose a time, answer a few short questions, and then we will jump on a call together and really figure out if the Sober Clear program could be a good match for you. But basically on that call, I will give you a roadmap to follow, the exact process that I take all my clients through, and then we'll either do it together or you can do it on your own. But either way, you'll get a ton of value from that call. So if you want to book a call, click the link down below. And now let's get into number 1. Now, although alcohol companies market alcohol as something that enhances a man's sex life, the truth couldn't be more different. For starters, alcohol will have a negative impact on both the quantity and quality of sperm. See, compared to non-drinkers, heavy drinkers have lower concentrations of sperm cells. See, the percentage of sperm cells that are properly formed also declines, as does the percentage of sperm cells that are actively moving forward. So you end up having fewer sperm cells that are more poorly formed and with lower mobility. The worst possible scenario if you want to have children. But the damage here isn't just limited to your sperm. Alcohol will attack at the root of your endocrine system, and it will disrupt all the hormones necessary for your normal sexual functioning, starting with the luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. The follicle-stimulating hormone is secreted by the pituitary gland and stimulates production of semen. The luteinizing hormone stimulates testosterone synthesis. And, unsurprisingly, testosterone levels in heavy drinkers are often pathologically low. For example, one study that compared 200 heavy drinkers to 160 controls found their average serum testosterone levels were about 15% lower. Now, alcohol also directly attacks the testicles, often to the point of visible testicular atrophy. They literally shrink in size. These testicular changes can have knock-on effects on secondary male sexual characteristics. So, you can get symptoms like reduced facial and bodily hair, breast enlargement, and alterations in the distribution of fat. All this is especially pronounced with advanced liver damage. According to one estimate, up to half of all men with advanced liver disease will have shrunk testicles. And over 70% of these men will also suffer from decreased libido, and this is often accompanied by impotence. To give you an idea of how bad things become in advanced alcoholism, in one classic study from the 1970s, 22 people suffering with alcohol use disorder with a liver disease were asked to ejaculate for the purposes of a semen analysis. And here's the crazy thing, 18 were unable to do so, and of the remaining 4, only 1 had normal sperm. A good question is the extent to which the damage is reversible. In other words, can you hope to reverse this sexual dysfunction if you actually stop drinking? Well, unfortunately, the data that we have suggests that this will not happen for all or even most men. For example, one study followed 60 former drinkers who struggled with impotence. After 2 years of sobriety, only 25% had recovered their sexual functioning. Another team of doctors that followed recovered drinkers for several years found a recovery rate of 50%. Now, number 2. So, the combined cost of alcohol in developing economies is absolutely eye-watering. A much-cited report released a few years ago estimated the total cost to the US economy in 2006 at $223 billion. This is the equivalent of around $340 billion in today's money, or approximately $3 for every drink. For comparison, the report cited the annual cost to the economy from smoking as being 13% lower. The report calculated that this cost is borne in equal parts by the drinker themselves and the government, i.e. the taxpayer. What's really shocking is that most of this economic damage is down to indirect rather than direct costs. So what exactly do we mean by this? Well, when most people think about the cost of alcohol, the things that come to mind are stuff that needs to be paid for, things that consume resources. The most important of these are far and away healthcare costs from alcohol-related diseases. Then there are the costs to the criminal justice system from all the alcohol-related crimes, damages, and traffic accidents, and various other costs. For example, the salaries of social workers who deal with alcohol-related problems. But stunningly, Crucially, these direct costs only account for slightly less than 40% of all the damage to the economy. The rest is indirect costs, namely that reflect loss of productivity. For starters, there is the loss of productivity from all the health problems and lost work due to illness. Then there is alcohol-related unemployment, absenteeism, and lowered productivity. Last but not least are the losses from those people who left the economic workforce completely. Usually this will be from premature death, but sometimes from premature retirement or even incarceration. And the average person who dies from alcohol will do so many years before their time. I will tell you exactly how much later on, and that number is stunning, so wait for that. But the point here is that as a society, we invest unfathomable sums of money in raising and educating these people for 12 to 15 years, only to then have them die off prematurely before they've had a chance to give back to the economy. So when you add all this up, the average cost of alcohol on the world's economies is 2.6% of GDP. In other words, on average, a modern economy loses 2.6% of its total economic output to alcohol. Money that is almost literally flushed down a toilet. So let's get into number 3. Now, one of the most enduring myths of alcohol is that it's of a quote social lubricant. According to this idea, alcohol somehow makes our social lives easier. It breaks down our social inhibitions, turns us all warm and fuzzy inside, and makes bonding a breeze. Right? Now, there is a tiny kernel of truth to some of this. In the appropriate doses, alcohol can indeed numb social anxiety and allow somebody to feel a little bit more comfortable with strangers. But this is only in very circumscribed situations and for the most brief period of time. Something like a bar or a party or some other social event where people are drinking. You may indeed find it easier to approach that stranger and strike up a conversation after a few drinks. Now, of course, depending on alcohol to do this will ensure that you never develop the confidence to actually go and do things like this on your own, to actually overcome your fears without the alcohol crutch. But setting that aside, the problem is that any meaningful human relation lasts far longer than a couple of hours. Ideally, you want a serious relationship, be it romantic, platonic, family, community, spiritual, whatever it is, to last for life. And it's clear that the only influence drinking can have in the wider context is destructive. Alcohol is really the equivalent of a nuclear bomb on your social landscape, and drinkers are often among the most lonely creatures that you will meet. Starting from the lies and denials about the drinking, the neglect of responsibilities, the inconsistencies, unpredictabilities, lack of communication, all the way to potentially violent and even criminal behaviour. Just as an example, in the UK, where I'm from, alcohol is implicated in up to 1/3 of all domestic violence cases. Pretty difficult to have a meaningful relationship with your spouse if you're physically assaulting them. Even if things don't get to the point of violence, let's be honest, who in their right mind wants to hang around a drunk? Now, we all understand this at some level. It's not rocket science. But let me tell you something that you probably don't know. See, alcohol actually destroys social relations by corroding the very neural machinery that makes these relations possible. See, though we actually take this for granted, there are actually a staggering number of processes and computations that need to happen in our brain in order for us to build and sustain relationships. For starters, we need to be able to recognize and remember the other person. We have to learn to decode their facial expressions, their voice and gestures. And we also have to be able to predict their behavior, starting from the impact of our very own actions. In other words, how will they perceive our actions, what emotional state this perception will cause inside them, and what actions that these emotions are then likely to cause. Otherwise, you're just going to upset everybody. And last but not least, we have to be in touch with our emotions, to be able to identify them, process them, and when necessary, communicate them. And then we have to calibrate our behavior based on our understanding of these internal emotional states. Now, all of this is made possible by dedicated neural centers in our brain. Scientists refer to these as the so-called social brain, and sadly, alcohol affects the social brain across the board. Heavy drinkers show impairments in essentially all aspects of social functioning. For starters, their ability to recognize emotions in other individuals is severely affected. They're just not as good at decoding facial expressions, voice changes, and body postures to understand how another person feels. They also have problems with their own emotions. See, compared to non-drinkers, these people find it difficult to identify, differentiate, and express their emotions. Scientists call this alexithymia. Their ability to empathize and see things from the other person's perspective can also be compromised. Compared to non-drinkers, they are simply not as good at predicting how novel situations will affect other people's behavior. And for this reason, they are not very good at predicting how their own actions will affect other people's views and behavior toward themselves. So all these deficits combined increase the frequency of inappropriate social behaviors and can severely compromise the ability to maintain meaningful long-term relations. So let's get to number 4. Now, sadly, it's not just your social brain that will suffer. Alcohol is a potent neurotoxin and will attack more or less the entirety of your brain. For starters, it will eat away at the myelin, the fatty white substance that acts as insulation for the transmission of electrical signals between brain cells. It will also directly kill the two major classes of cells inside our brain: the neurons, which are the cells that transmit the signals, as well as the so-called glial cells. These glial cells support the neurons in various ways, for example by removing waste products and providing structural support. As you can imagine, you can't keep on losing all these cells and still maintain your previous brain mass. Just like with your testicles, booze will eventually shrink your brain. You see, unlike most other cells, the neurons of adult humans do not replicate. Once one dies, it's gone for good. So you go through life with more or less the same number of neurons that you're actually born with. After a certain number of neurons have died off, the brain becomes noticeably lighter in weight and reduced in volume. For example, one study out of Australia compared the brains of 22 deceased people suffering with AUD to those of 22 healthy controls. Now, the AUD sufferers' brains weighed on average 71 grams less, at 1,298 grams versus 1,369 for the controls. This is a 5% weight loss, which came with a corresponding 5% loss in volume. With modern imaging technology, researchers can actually look at these changes in greater detail. And thanks to these technological advances, we now know that A, no part of the brain is spared, and B, some parts are hit especially hard. I won't go into the details here, as we've covered this topic previously, and if you click the link up here, wherever it is, you'll be able to access a video that goes deeper into how alcohol impacts the brain. But the good news is that if you stop drinking, your brain volume will recover. The recovery will be the most dramatic during the first month, and by the end of the first year, you will have recovered most of your lost volume. Now, as we mentioned earlier, once a neuron is lost, it cannot come back. So this brain recovery after abstinence comes about through other means. Presumably, the remaining neurons increase the number of connections to compensate for the ones who died off. Now let's get into number 5. So according to the World Health Organization's 2018 report on the global impact of alcohol on health, alcohol results in some 3 million deaths annually. This represents 5.3% of all deaths worldwide. Let that sink in for a second. More than 1 out of every 20 deaths will be alcohol related. That's across all countries and all causes of death. A whopping 28% of these deaths were violent in nature. These include things like traffic accidents, murder and suicide. A further 21% were due to digestive disorders including liver disease, and 19% were due to cardiovascular disease. Now further down this morbid list, we have cancers and infectious diseases, both around 13% each. The remaining deaths were down to a variety of health complications. Men will suffer disproportionately, making up around 3/4 of these deaths. To give you an idea of just how inextricably linked alcohol is in some of these conditions, worldwide drinking is involved in 48% of all instances of liver cirrhosis, as well as 26% of the mouth, 22% of the larynx, and 17% of esophagus cancer. It's also involved in a whopping 27% of all road injuries, 18% of suicides, and 18% of homicide. Just for a second, try and wrap your head around these numbers for a minute. Nearly 1 out of 5 people on this planet who take their lives will do so under the influence of this evil drug. Now, we'll come back to this in a minute, but overall, alcohol can contribute to more than 200 different health diseases and health problems. The WHO estimates that 2.3 billion people are currently drinking, and sadly, consumption levels have risen dramatically over the last 20 years. From a worldwide average of 5.5 litres of alcohol in 2005 to 6.4 in 2010, and on its way to reaching 7.6 by 2020. Finally, let's look at number 6. So, remember earlier in the video when we were discussing the alcohol-related damage to the economy? Well, I promised I would tell you exactly how many years before their time the average person who dies an alcohol-related death will go. Well, according to the Centers for Disease Control, somebody who dies an alcohol-related death in the United States loses on average a whopping 29 years of their life. For comparison, the average person who dies from smoking loses an average of only 10 years of their life. When you actually count the total number of lost life years from drinking, they are not much lower than smoking. See, while cigarettes kills more people than alcohol, these people die on average far older, so the total number of years lost becomes almost comparable. For example, remember earlier when we mentioned that alcohol is involved in nearly 1 out of every 5 suicides? Well, these are not typically old people. They're often in their 20s, 30s, and even teenagers. They're having some problems in their life, maybe feeling lonely, and after a few drinks, everything just seems so hopeless. So often what can happen is they get this tunnel vision that doesn't allow them to see a way out of their problems, everything just seems hopeless. So they do something that they would otherwise not do. Then you have typical alcohol diseases that disproportionately affect the younger age brackets. For example, cirrhosis of the liver, which will often kill off people in their 30s or 40s. See, when all is said and done, fully 1 out of 5 people who die from drinking will actually do so before they even turn 35. And if you click the video on the screen now, you can learn 3 secrets that will actually help you control your drinking fast.